piece of paper with my pencil apparently.
Yeah, you look familiar to me. Yes, you are. Oh, okay, yeah, I remember the name. Yeah. I don't know from where.
Find it again.
The problem is, we're supposed to get this. You remember names, but I don't remember who it is.
Okay.
Yeah, we get space but not change, the name but not the same.
Yeah, we should be on this, yeah.
You're many. Yeah.
Technology.
I think we're good.
Yeah.
Did you part of
Are you ready to go?
I won the lottery for today. I got about
Yeah. Yeah. Looks great. Don't sign it. None of us were guys when we first walked in. You know, when you retire, you're 10 years younger than. I wish I did.
Yeah. Yeah, but then I'm not familiar with university. This is UAB, doing 34. I got no idea what UAB doing 34.
Good afternoon, everyone.
That's what I thought.
Everybody know how to whistle? Good afternoon. Hello, hello. Yeah, I wish I could whistle.
Around here.
Good afternoon, everyone. Just like at home, I'm ignored. Welcome to our first of the speaker series for this year. Scott's done a great job of putting together people, history, politics, literature, science. You covered them all, and you did a great job. So this is a really exciting term for us. And starting out with Ray is wonderful. It's wonderful. Been here before, and we're welcome to have him back again. I only want to mention one thing with the ALLI, the Albany Lifelong Learning Institute. It is moving along. I know people are asking questions, and Carol is doing great work. You all be happy to know that the bureaucracy at the University of Albany is still working very well.
Slowly.
You know,
Slowly. Slowly.
the problem is the roadblocks that I put up for all of you for so long are still working great. So, you know, you could be happy about that. No. It just took a little longer to set up our accounts. It's important for the registration to work right and the payments all to work right so that and parking. We got over that hurdle. Now we're working on setting up Marketplace so it works efficiently, and we're going to be talking to them this week, and we're really hopeful that by spring we're ready to go. So you'll continue to see those advertisements come out. We've got 3 lined up. The controversial Insanity Defense in America History by Richard Hahn. Some of you may know him. Aging Well in Your 80s and Beyond. Yuki Young is going to do that one for us. And Non-Victorian Fiction, 1966 to 2023. And that's Randall Craig, if you know Randall. So they're all ready to go. They were nice enough. They had planned to do it in the fall, and they were nice enough for us to redo their schedule to be able to do it in the spring. So we're really excited about it. There'll be more to come. Just wanted to keep that on your radar, and we'll be continue to talk about it. So now I'll turn it over to our director of the speaker unit, and Scott Birch.
Thank you. Thank you. The analog guy in the digital world. On the shelf over there, we have some brand new schedules. So if you all want to take one, it's all printed on both sides. And it's newly renovated because we had kind of just a bleh title. And unfortunately, our meteorological speaker coming in December, which I'm really excited about, just gave me the real title last night after I had printed them all. So we will have another cut with that, but all the speakers and all the workshops are correct on that. So thank you all for coming. This is great. And Ray, thank you so much for kicking this off. I mentioned to Ray, we'd love to have him speak today, and he said, "It's not much time, but I can handle it." And just very, very grateful that you were able to be here with us today. Ray, of course, is a professor emeritus and Collins Fellow, and largely from the Department of Geography and Planning. Beyond Moses, Rethinking the New York Metro Region's Public Works from 1924 to 1974 is the title. Ray's research, teaching, and consultancy career focuses on city and regional planning, urban studies, and international development. Originally from the UK, he received his BA in geography from Cambridge University in 1969 and his PhD from Cambridge in 1975. He has 9 years of field experience in Latin America. He talked my brother into going down there, as a matter of fact, or coming back from it, one of the two. And he's had a lengthy career with the Swansea University, 1971 to 1984. And since 1985, he's been here with us at UAlbany. Ray is a certified planner and has served as a consultant to more than a dozen international organizations, national governments, and regional agencies. He has authored, co-authored, or edited numerous books and articles. His research is multidisciplinary social science on a wide range of scales from global to local, including regional surveys, ethnographic and biographical essays, and historical studies. His current presentation outlines a book project that he's developing on the 20th century history of public works in the tri-state New York metropolitan region, reinterpreting the contributions of Robert Moses and the roles, responsibilities, and interactions of federal, state, and local governments. So with Ray here, we're going to let Moses lead us into the semester. Thank you for chuckling. Ray, thank you very much.
Thank you, and many thanks for the 2-3 Voices awards that I've received to go to places which are not Albany and not New York City or the New York metropolitan region, but which were really very important. And I'll take you to one of those places at the end of this presentation. But I have to apologize that I'm unusually disorganized this morning. My wife had a medical crisis. I've spent 3 hours in doctors' waiting rooms and stuff. And I did manage to eat lunch. But I had to do it in less than 10 minutes. But anyway, I'm functioning. So I'm working on a book. And it's not my first book. I've edited quite a number of books. I've co-authored 2 books and authored 1 slim book, about 120 pages. But this is going to be a big book. And the title of the big book is Beyond Moses, and probably roughly the words that are there below. In other words, we have a period which was the period in which Robert Moses was a very important person in the public works history of the New York metropolitan region. And I'm trying to help New Yorkers to better understand and interpret that period. And there are a number of problems. It's a very difficult subject to write about because Robert Moses was a very important person, but his importance is exaggerated. So, can we somehow or other come down from highly, extremely to very is the problem. And how do you say too much has been written about this person, too much attention has been given to this person by then writing about this person? It's a difficult situation. And of course, the blame, in quotes, rests overwhelmingly on this book. And this is how the book appears when New York intellectuals are at our being interviewed on television. You always stand in front of a bookshelf with the Power Broker as the most important book on the bookshelf, the most visible, which is partly the design of the book, which makes it extremely visible, but also it's its placement. It's got to be there, because anyone who is a New York intellectual would be a complete idiot and moron if they didn't have the Power Broker to somehow or other explain everything. Problem is, the Power Broker doesn't really explain everything. It is a biography. And a biography is the life of, story of, in many senses, one person. And to make a biography useful and interesting, the author, the biographer, has to focus everything on and around that person. So really what we should be thinking about is not the story of Robert Moses and how Robert Moses changed everything and did everything and made everything happen, and nowhere else in the world has anything happened because there was no Robert Moses, you know. Instead, what we have to do is to try to say things happened in a socioeconomic system over an extended historical period, and this was the contribution of this one person. But the following other people are extremely important, and what we should be doing is focusing on history. Now, the author of the biography, Robert Caro, is, of course, extremely famous. And this was a path-breaking biography in many senses. Longer, richer in terms of prose than most biographies, consuming an enormous amount of time from the viewpoint of the author. And for Moses, it was his first major project, his first book. And the book came out in 1974. And basically he and his wife, who came from upper middle class origins and had some money, he was a journalist with Long Island Newsday, and they had a house on Long Island, and they sold the house and then lived on the interest of the money that they had for 7 years to pay their rent and to pay their expenses to do this book. And so pretty obviously at the end of 7 years, he was quite desperate to have a successful book. And the net result is, as a first book, he wrote a book which sometimes went a little bit further than necessary to make the case, because you've got to convince people to read it, to buy it, to talk about it, and so on. And he was incredibly successful. The Power Broker, this week, on the 16th of September, celebrates its 50th birthday, the day of publication in 1974. And it's because of that that I chose to speak about this element of my study, which is meant to be a lot broader. It's meant to be, how do we understand the whole process of public works in the New York metropolitan region in the Moses 50 years, 24 to 74, you know, but not exaggerating the role of Moses. And the first thing that you have to do in order to think about this is to do something very simple. Cross the Hudson River. Go to New Jersey. The question in New Jersey, who built it, doesn't have an answer. It was built by the state. It was built by the Turnpike Authority. It was built during the mayoralty of, I can't remember, etc. Now, just to give you one simple example, Caro's favorite case study, and the longest case study in the Power Broker, is the Cross Bronx Expressway. Shakes up 3 chapters. And the Cross Bronx Expressway is 7 miles, and it took 20 years from the announcement of the project with its routing and design through to its completion, 7 miles. The New Jersey Turnpike is 118 miles, and it took 27 months. The Garden State Parkway is 180 miles, and it took 36 months. New Jersey does things like lightning, but nobody did it. It was just the Turnpike Authority. It was just the Parkway people. Oh, it was under Governor, I can't remember his name, you know. In other words, what you have in New York City is a cult and a culture of personal authorship and personality. Suggestion, you know. However, when you actually think a little bit more about this, what you realize is that Moses and the organizations that he was involved with, they all had the culture of saying, Robert Moses did, Robert Moses said, Robert Moses this. So thousands of people working for or under or coordinated by or working with Robert Moses or a Robert Moses headed organization, they all immediately recite the words Robert Moses as who did it, who explained it. So Robert Moses in general is known in the news media as most frequently the master builder. Now, I'm not sure that he ever cemented one brick to another. I'm not sure that he ever used a spade except in, you know, a project inauguration where you take one spadeful of earth and move it a little bit that way, and then, you know, everybody claps, you give a speech, and then the real workers get to work. So the reality is Robert Moses never built anything. Thousands of workers directed by engineers and construction executives and so on, implemented the designs of hundreds of architects, landscape architects, civil engineers, etc. Robert Moses was a public administrator. That was his background. He had bachelor's, master's, PhD degrees in public administration, primarily from Yale and also from Oxford and Columbia. Okay, so you know, he had a wonderful package of degrees. And he was a very, very keen broadcaster and author. He almost every week gave speeches at things like Rotary lunches and so on. Do you remember the days of things like Rotary lunches? They've become like an extinct dinosaur now, but you know, they were important in those days. So he was accustomed to giving 50 plus speeches a year, for doing major groundbreaking ceremonies and inauguration ceremonies for every public work that he was involved with. He used public money to design and print very simple brochures, about typically 8 to 16 pages, letter size, with photographs, lots of color, lots of illustration, small amounts of text. And 5,000 of these would be printed and they would be distributed all over the place. I've got hundreds of them as souvenirs, and there are many that I've not been able to get. You know, it's, he was very, very concerned about publicity. And he was very, very concerned. There's probably no historical figure who has been so meticulous about making sure that every piece of paper he was involved with, like signing a letter or whatever, is placed into an archive. You know, it's so the quantity of Moses material is phenomenal. And the number of people who have read newspaper articles, magazine articles, several books and other things by Moses is very large. And all of that has an implication in terms of this culture of saying Robert Moses did. And sometimes he's not called the master builder, he's called the master planner. And that is also bizarre because, speaking as an urban and regional planner, he really, throughout his career, insulted and ridiculed professional planners. These are too theoretical. They're looking too far into the future. They're trying to be comprehensive. We simply have to identify the 4 immediate priority projects and get on with those projects. That was the Moses philosophy. And that was what he did throughout his career, you know, to just pull out from plans and lists of suggestions a few projects and try to push them through. The reality in the metro New York area is that about half of all the projects that he tried to push through were never built. He wasn't such a master that everything he was associated with happened. And even when it did happen, it often took a very long time. But let's go back to dear old New Jersey. Not only is he not responsible for any road or any public work in New Jersey, and the whole Moses discussion is meaningless in New Jersey. The same occurs in Connecticut, part of the tri-state metropolitan region. Again, he had no role except getting his undergraduate degree at Yale. And he was born there in New Haven. But he had no role whatsoever in Connecticut's public works. And some of Connecticut's public works were built ahead of the equivalent public works in New York. I-95 is a good example. Through Fairfield County, it was completed before I-95 was completed through Westchester. You get this general situation, but then you have to think also of organizations. All the Hudson River crossings going from New Jersey to Manhattan and going from New Jersey to Staten Island, all of those crossings were built or taken over by the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. It was originally called the Port of New York Authority, but then it was later renamed. And the Port Authority is a bi-state organization, and it has the opposite culture to everything that Moses was involved with. You don't name names. It was built by the Port Authority, period. It is run by the Port Authority, period. Who can change the Port Authority? Well, the reality is, since it was created, nobody, because it was created jointly by New York and New Jersey, the 2 states, and the 2 state governments never agree about what change should be made. So no change has been made. It's really run right the way through from 1921 onwards, you know. Yeah. So the Port Authority does all the Hudson River bridges and tunnels. And in fact, it also financed 50% of the Verrazano Bridge. And of course, it runs all the airports of the New York metropolitan region. Just after during and after World War II, Moses wanted to run the airports and actually started some public works projects, but couldn't raise very much money. And the airports were shifted over to the Port Authority, which has run them ever since, and has spent large amounts of money, some of it wasted, some of it useful. But, you know, it was a defeat for Moses. Moses was going to build 2 expressways across Manhattan. The Lower Manhattan Expressway, the Mid Manhattan Expressway, neither was ever built. after 20 years of debating and fighting and so on, even though he had massive support, especially from David Rockefeller, the brother of Governor Nelson and so on, the whole Chase Manhattan Bank apparatus. He was going to build 2 expressways across Brooklyn. They were never built. He was going to build another expressway, what started as the Sheridan Expressway in the Bronx, that was going to go all the way north, but it never went all the way north. And so on and so on. You can keep on listing project after project that Moses did not succeed in building. So even though he had a limited inventory, he only pulled off about half of half of what was on the inventory for anything in New York City. He was somewhat more successful on Long Island, but he was defeated again and again on the north coast of Long Island. The rich people who have their mansions on the north coast did not want middle-class people coming to look at the beach or the view or the whatever, and they blocked project after project after project. So all his great successes are on the south side of Long Island, the most famous, of course, being Jones Beach. So you have a strange situation. You have the master builder and master planner who is neither of those two things, but who has an enormous reputation. And Robert Caro quite literally contributed a great deal to a reputation that was already very substantial. The book, The Power Broker, came out in 1974. And Caro worked on the book for 7 continuous years before then. But after 1974, he very quickly dropped his next project, which was going to be a biographical book of Fiorello LaGuardia. Not New York again, not somebody who shared the stage with Moses in many senses for an extended part of Moses's career. I'm going to do something completely different. And so he latched on to LBJ. And ever since then, he has been the biographer of LBJ. And he has now published 4 out of what are thought to be 5 volumes of LBJ's biography. There are already over 3,000 pages in the first 4 volumes. He's working on the 5th volume and hopes to finish it not later than 2030. Now, that's a little bit scary, given that he was born in 1936, I think. But he's working away and behaving as he's very self-confident of finishing it. And of course, he's received innumerable awards. I don't have the list right in front of me for his writing. He is, without any question, really, the most revered biographer in the United States, perhaps in the world. And he's acquired a sort of sacred and saintly reputation because he has been so committed to his work and writes in such an extraordinary style. And I'll give you just, well, let's take it actually. Maybe I should show some pictures. Okay, I'll move over here and take you through some stuff. And of course, it is albany.edu. Okay, so this is a picture of Robert Moses, not the communist one, but it's a picture of Robert Moses standing in front of a children's playground. And one of his great achievements was to construct more than 600 children's playgrounds in New York City. Every neighborhood has them. Caro says, no, black neighborhoods don't have them. Puerto Rican neighborhoods don't have them. Only middle-class neighborhoods have them. That's bullshit. Every neighborhood has playgrounds that Moses was involved in encouraging, coordinating their construction. Doesn't mean he didn't build them. He didn't dig the holes. He didn't pour the concrete or whatever, but he was involved in coordinating their construction. And that was one of his great achievements. This was particularly in the New Deal period, when he was very expert as a good public administrator, highly motivated in getting federal New Deal money. Okay, so this is Moses. This is Robert Caro. That picture's about 5 years ago. He's a little more gray-haired now, and this is a very interesting figure. Jane Jacobs, author of the Death and Life of Great American Cities. One of the strange features of the whole Moses story in New York City since the year 2000 is that people have felt, oh, Moses, it's like he's this utterly boring, ordinary man. We're going to make him interesting. We're going to have some sex life in this. We're going to have some women, you know. And Jane Jacobs has been injected as being the alter Moses. So when Caro presented his biography, it was always very negative. In many senses, Moses's achievements were stated, but there were always details about the people who were betrayed, the people who were marginalized, the people who were made homeless, the people who, everything, the damage that had been done. And so what you get this picture of is someone who is very determined, but rather cruel in doing things. And so what we have to have then is someone who is nice. And the public view has taken a woman, Jane Jacobs, author of The Death and Life of Great American Cities, and turned her into the alter Moses, you know, the opposite. The strange thing is that Jane Jacobs is not mentioned anywhere in this book. And yet nowadays, you can't have a meeting about Moses. You can't have a discussion about Moses. You don't see an article about Moses without reference to Jane Jacobs. Very strange situation. But it's all part of a sort of New York City culture of personification. And that personification applies also to Long Island, Nassau and Suffolk counties. But it doesn't apply to Westchester and the Lower Hudson, where people don't talk about Moses and don't use Moses very much as an illustration of anything. So it's really limited to New York City and Nassau and Suffolk. Okay, let's try. Oh, it's down. I got it. Okay, so to give you just an idea of Caro's text, because his style is quite extraordinary. The first Cross Bronx Expressway chapter, for example, is called The Meat Axe. The tremendous extent of Robert Moses's power and the extent to which he shaped the greatest city in the New World and the great suburbs stretching out from it is demonstrated by the roads he built during the quarter of a century following World War II. These were roads like no other roads in history, for these were roads through a city. No one else built roads through cities, did they? Seems like he's never been to Detroit and Los Angeles, which were tremendous pioneers in ramming roads through cities, often ahead of New York. He doesn't seem to be familiar with the parkways and the expressways in Boston or in Washington or many other places. It's all New York. And all through the book and all through the way that New York intellectuals tend to conceive things, if you're a New York intellectual from New York City or Long Island, you don't pay much attention to Albany because they're a bunch of pathetic bureaucrats. They just get in the way. They don't do anything in any sense. you don't pay much attention to Washington either. You focus all the time on your local leadership. And this sort of very, very insular mentality is something which I first became aware of in 1966. I spent a month in the New York metropolitan region and walked large parts of New York City in 1966 before I went to college in the UK. And it always struck me then, the people that I got to talk to, how insular they were. I imagined this great world cosmopolitan city, you know, with people seriously discussing the impact of canals and roads and coup d'etats and crises in Uzbekistan and Paraguay and so on, you know, very local mindset in every sense, and a remarkable tendency to forget about the rest of New York State, the rest of the United States, and the rest of the metropolitan region, which just happens to be on the other side of the Hudson River, or just northeast from Westchester. You know, all of that was dropped down. He goes on to invoke Darius and Genghis Khan, the military highways of the Roman Empire, the Great Wall of China, and the 3 Silk Roads linking coastal China to Europe, the Middle East, and India, as examples of visionaries and projects that were great in their day, but not comparable to Moses's incredible 20th century projects in New York. You know, this is the style. For most of these roads, Moses had to hack paths through jungles of tenements and apartment houses, to slash aqueducts in two and push sewers aside, to lift railroads into the air or shove them underground. For one expressway, the Van Wyck, he had to hold up in the air at the busiest stretch of railroad in the world, the switching yard through which 13 tracks and sidings of the Long Island Railroad pass over, you know, this is all on one page. You know, now imagine 1,000, it's about 1,150 pages of text. And then you have to add in the references, the index, the contents and everything else. And you get up to 1,281 pages, I think it is, when you put it all together. And this is just one book. And the story that's told is that when the book was prepared, the publisher said, it can only be 1 volume, and one volume can't be bigger than this, so we have to take some material out. So supposedly a chapter on Jane Jacobs was taken out and lost forever. I literally mean lost forever. 50 years people have been saying, what was in that chapter? Does it exist? And other things were taken out. Supposedly about 300 pages of material was removed, destroyed, incinerated. It's difficult to imagine in every sense, but it's part of the whole panorama, you know. And then he takes revenge by doing a 5-volume LPJ, which is originally going to be just 3 volumes, but it fattened up. Okay. So that's the text. Now, Moses is not the only person who has been taken by a city. In Paris, whenever you talk about the layout of Paris, the design of Paris and so on, you inevitably get to the boulevards. And who was responsible for the boulevards? Baron Georges Eugene von Haussmann, with his meat axe, chopping the boulevard axes through the city and so on, and creating a city which most people now say is incredibly beautiful, very attractive and everything else. But he devastated and destroyed the city. He did. But that's the way it is. And we often forget that the first comprehensive superhighway system in the world was, of course, in Nazi Germany, built in the 1930s, the Autobahn system. And the main author was a man called Fritz Todt. And that became tied to a scheme to create the Volkswagen, the people's car, which would run on these so that you had massive national mass mobility as well as the capacity to move your troops very quickly from western to eastern, northern to southern, and so on, which became an instrument of the war. And there are other people who are largely forgotten. I'll just give you one example, but I could easily list out a dozen. You know, major figures that had enormous impact on the nation. In the world of public works, Thomas H. MacDonald was in charge of national roads from 1919 until 1953. And really all the preparation for the launching of the interstate highway system and other things was overseen by MacDonald. And the parkways, the expressways, everything was overseen by MacDonald all over the nation. You have another very obvious example, a figure called Bertram Tallamy, who was a New Yorker from Buffalo. He oversaw the construction of the thruway system, which was about 530 miles. And then he got a promotion of sorts and dealt with the interstate highway system under Eisenhower for the first 5 years of the launching of the interstate highway system. So Bertram Tallamy built, in quotes, he didn't build, the workers built it, you know, but Bertram Tallamy directed, oversaw the building of more than 10,000 miles of expressways across the whole of the United States. Does anybody remember Bertram Tallamy? He does at least have, you know, 1 or 2 pages. It's but only Moses has this extraordinary story. And the reality is there is no American city that has a figure equivalent to Moses, apart from New York with Moses. You know, and nowhere in the world have you got anything except perhaps Baron von Haussmann. It's not normal. The culture of public administration, the culture of civil engineering is not a superstar culture. It is you work for the Department of X of the government of Y, and you hand in your work and you go home and you enjoy your meals with the family and all the rest of it. You don't look for fame and fortune as a name. What Moses did, which was quite extraordinary, was he looked for fame with no fortune. You know, he came from a prosperous family, but actually he pretty much sped things down. He, at different points in his career, had between 9 and 13 public offices, which he was in charge of for the city, for the state, and other more localized entities. But he only received salary from 1 or 2 of those. And the salaries were very modest, like $30,000 a year. You know, it's very, very limited amounts of money. So when he died, his total estate was worth less than $75,000, including owning a house on Long Island. Money was not what he wanted, but what he wanted was people remembering his name and memorializing his achievements. And his achievements were also always based on boasting about how cheaply things had been done, how quickly they had been done to save money, because any delay would have cost the taxpayer more. So what you have is a very, very specific sort of style. You get these extraordinary pictures, and it's always important to remember this, that this is the world that was created in the 1950s, 60s, 70s of the interstate highway system. This was the world that was envisioned at the time of the World's Fair of 1939 to 40 that Moses oversaw. This was the original beginnings, if you like, of the automobile. This was the world that occurred in the 1920s and early 1930s in the United States, which was the first country in the world to develop a mass market for cars, to the extent that in the early 1930s, 80% of all the automobiles in the world were in the United States. The Volkswagen came a bit later, First ones were manufactured in 1939. And the idea of Europeans in their small cars, that's really a post-World War II thing. But in the US, this was the world of the 1920s, if you like. So the ultimate downfall of Moses was produced by someone who was more important and more powerful in many senses, Governor Nelson Rockefeller. And of course, right here in Albany, we have the grandiose project of the Empire State Plaza, Rockefeller's Eternal Memorial, which is a verticalized Brasilia. So, you know, that's essentially what it is. And 44 blocks of the city were cleared in order to build the plaza and its access roads. The city's population went down from 130,000 eventually to less than 100,000 and so on, which means that as a proportion of city life, Rockefeller's Empire State Plaza was bigger than any renewal project in any other city in the United States. What Moses did in terms of urban renewal, which is in the latter part of his career in New York City, primarily in Manhattan, was almost small in proportion to the size of the city. It didn't affect the city life anything like as much as Rockefeller did in Albany. And here you have the ultimate nonentity, Austin Tobin. Austin Tobin headed the Port Authority of New York for 30 years. He was overwhelmingly responsible for the 3 airports, for the World Trade Center, for a system of industrial parks, for transferring most of the port activity from the New York side to the New Jersey side, and so on and so on. But he hated being interviewed, just refused. He wouldn't answer the phone if he didn't give, very rarely did he ever give a public lecture. Incredibly rarely he wrote a 1 or 2 page article. He didn't write books, he didn't broadcast, etc. He never imagined that his purpose in life was eternal life. Moses did. And so this is the picture of the power broker. 1,281 pages, 7 years of full-time work, won its various prizes and so on. And then, how did Caro actually put together a biography? You've got to make it sell. You've got to get your reader to remember. So you use a very, very powerful prose, lots of extraordinary analogies. I mean, to compare Robert Moses to Genghis Khan, it's extraordinary in many senses. Anything, and focus on, you know, behaving like a prosecutor, making the message very, very clear, having a story. And Caro's story was, you know, the young, innocent Robert Moses ends up being corrupted by power. And in his later life, he becomes a tyrant who destroys communities and overrides people, massive scale. Now, there is another way of putting this. In the early part of his career, he was engaged more than anything else in parks, playgrounds, parkways, the 3 Ps, and the parkways were out on Long Island going through rural areas around the extreme perimeter of New York at a time when that perimeter was not built up, so that you could build very easily, displacing very few people. And his vision of parkways was that you would get in an automobile and go to the seaside for fun. It wasn't as a commuter route. Now they've become commuter routes. They're really very dangerous. You have to look closely at the highway the whole time because everyone's going at 10, 15, 20 miles above the speed limit and so on. They're more dangerous than expressways. expressways have trucks, so you tend to avoid them. You take the parkways, but you're more likely to kill yourself on a parkway. That's the reality now of parkways. But that wasn't the way he presented parkways. So parkways, playgrounds were his speciality. And he, of course, did Jones Beach. Later on, he did Orchard Beach in the Bronx and other things. These are all beautiful recreational opportunities for the population. Good guy. But as he got older, he followed the money. And the money was federal money, and it was money that was available in legislation of 1949, 1954, and 1956 for urban renewal and interstate highways. And that money involved building through and into cities. And so when you build through and into cities, you have to demolish, you have to evict, you have to relocate, et cetera, and if you're slow in doing that, you spend a lot more public money. So it's, in many senses, better to do it quickly. Now, you can criticize the problems that, or you can comment on, describe the problems that the people who were evicted, the people who had to move, had. But these were issues of national and state policy. It wasn't Robert Moses' decision that tenants did not get compensation. Homeowners got compensation, but it depended on a government valuation of the home, which may or may not be the real value of the home, and so on. Tenants don't get compensation. More than 3/4 of the population of New York City are tenants, so you do have a special problem. But you inevitably have the argument, if he hadn't done it, somebody else would have. Because these things were financed with federal funding, federal legislation. So the interstate highways, like the BQE and the Cross Bronx and so on, those were funded in construction 90% by the feds, 10% by the states, 0 by the city. And the expropriations, compensations, and evictions were funded 50% by the city, 50% by the state. So the overwhelming majority was covered by the federal government. And the federal government had to do the same in Idaho as it did in New York, which essentially said in every state, only the state government will build. So the state government will build. State government didn't have bulldozers, engineers, etc. in many cases. They simply gave the job to contractors. In New York, we had a fairly well-organized set of engineers and others who inspected the projects, but they didn't necessarily get very closely involved. But the basic rule was, for all the construction, the state directs it. The feds will reimburse 90% when you submit your invoices. That's it. You know, the city was not involved. Moses was not involved because he had no state role that had to do with constructing highways or urban renewal. His roles were city roles. Okay, I think I've talked more than enough. You can get the picture a little bit. There's many, many other things that I could have gone into, but you know, so what I'm dealing with, and this is a small part of my overall project, is how to manage the enormous impact of Robert Caro in trying to explain what actually happened and to link that to other places. Now, I'll walk you through some bits of this. I was actually going to shorten this morning, but my wife's medical problem, which took up the whole of my morning, prevented me from doing that. This is Interstate 10, the Katy Freeway in Houston. Now, the Houston metro area is the 4th or 5th, depending on how you calculate it, most populous metro area in the United States, with approaching 5 million people. In other words, it's a quarter the size of the New York metro area. But it has a more comprehensive network of expressways and much wider expressways than New York has. And the extreme case is the Katy Freeway, which can go up to 18 lanes of the main expressway. Moses in the 1940s gave speech after speech after speech in which he said no expressway should ever have more than 6 lanes, 3 plus 3, they've got 18. New York occasionally goes up to 4 plus 4 and even 5 plus 5 in a few places, but never more than that. We don't have anything that compares with Houston's expressways or Dallas's expressways or Atlanta's expressways or Chicago's expressways or New Jersey's expressways. There's often 12 and 14 lanes on the New Jersey Turnpike. We don't have that on the New York side of the Hudson River. So why is Robert Moses so important? He didn't drive a car. He constantly demanded tough, highly enforced speed limits, all sorts of laws and rules to keep drivers in order. And he had to be driven everywhere he went. And strangely, Robert Moses, Jane Jacobs, and also Lewis Mumford, none of them ever drove cars. Okay, let me just take you a couple more pictures of the Katy Freeway. This one, close to downtown Houston.
Oh,
This one, a little bit further out. This one, typical intersection, 4 levels. They have to actually have one 5-level intersection in Houston. And yet, who built them? The government. What government? Well, mainly the state government, but they did get a lot of federal money. That's the story. It wasn't a person. There is no one who's been put in that special role of being the person who did it. And of course, in Houston, they're Texans. So they actually boast that the Katy Freeway is the widest in the world and so on. Just as Moses boasts, just as Caro boasts at times about New York. Problem is, some of the assertions are just plain ridiculous. He asserts that the Cross Bronx Expressway is the most expensive highway in human history. Just go to the Central Arterial in Boston, not the new one, which cost $15 billion, but the old one, which was up on stilts. That was double the cost per mile of the Cross Bronx Expressway and built at the same time in the 1950s and early 1960s. That's just Boston. So it's very easy. New Yorkers make these assertions, Texans make these assertions. They're not necessarily true. They haven't traveled the world and checked every case. There is no Guinness Book of Records or league that really checks these out. Okay, so I will shut up at that point. I think I hopefully at least communicated some of the interest and enthusiasm of the project. Sorry to be so disorganized, but this morning's medical craziness.
Great. Thank you for a great program. When I was a graduate public administration student in the late 90s, it was required reading to read Power Broker. And we were very excited when the New York State Public Administration Council or Association invited Robert Moses to speak. Now, at that time, he was a very elderly man. And somebody in the audience, I remember, challenged him on what he had done. And I thought the man was going to have a stroke. Oh, he got so agitated to the fact that it was almost impossible to understand what he was saying, but he was refuting the accusations made by this young man who had lived in New York and had seen what he thought was the destruction of his neighborhood. It was a very interesting situation. I wondered if anybody else here was in that audience, because it attracted a lot of people when Robert Moses was coming to Albany to speak.
I have a general impression that he was rather, I would say, muted in responding to Cairo. You know, he didn't seek out a major publication to put a detailed refutation. He submitted a 23-page manuscript, but which you can read on the internet. But you know, I really felt that he was always in two minds, because what mattered to him most was, I made history. If some people don't like or misinterpret or lie about the history, so be it. But I made history. I got things done, you know.
Talked about his accomplishments. And I think it was when he was challenged that he really got defensive and beaten up about it. But I would have assumed that he had been challenged over and over and over about it. But of course, Carol book had lauded him to such an extent that he would, I think he expected to be seen as a hero, as somebody who didn't have any detractors.
He's still, when you go to Long Island, there's still an overwhelming majority of "we love Robert Moses" sort of thinking. It's really the New York City side, especially the Manhattan intellectual side, that says no, you know.
Well, there are, Long Island, there are beaches named Robert Moses, so that might be why, you know, another generation of people who remember the person, they only remember that, but I think, first, and about the comparison to Genghis Khan, you know, I mean, Genghis Khan never forced the Dodgers into Brooklyn, so. I don't really believe that, but I know that's the story that goes around. But he did cooperate. Moses did cooperate with Robert Caro for a while, right?
Yeah,
He
they had
invited him
9 or
to his
10
house and-
short interviews.
Yeah, he does, I know he quotes him a few times in the book, but I do think, you know, you talk about like the New York State Thruway is so long and it was so much simpler and not personified the same way. But the fact that, and again, I don't know, you know, maybe it is overblown, but all the human suffering that is attributed to Robert Moses, I think is really what makes him the famous villain that he is, rather than the size of the projects. You know, I think a lot of people admired the size of the projects. And I know his original, when he first started building in Long Island, the Parks Department guy in the Mid-Hudson area became his rival, and that was FDR, right? And then, you know, and you know, he had unmean things to say about Moses at times too, you know, even though they were adversaries on a lot of things.
One of the projects that Moses was not responsible for, above and beyond the Thruway, with which he had nothing to do, you know, but also he was not responsible for the Taconic.
Right, no, I'm
The
saying that.
Taconic
You said,
was
you know,
FDR's
you named those other
project,
people, but
you
I'm
know.
saying it was the assumption among people who read Caro's book, and I'm one of his fans from that, but you know, is that, well, there wasn't that human suffering associated with it, so we don't really think about who built it, because it's just, you know, it's there, and the same, the Taconic and the Thruway are compared to the Cross Bronx Expressway, and then the story about the East Fremont neighborhood, and how the South Bronx was a really nice middle-class neighborhood until they tore it apart. Yeah, I mean, well, you know, with the, obviously, you know,
No, I mean,
you know, the book's position on that.
in 1990, I worked for several months in that neighborhood and actually used to sit and eat my lunch overlooking the Cross Bronx Expressway. How can you put it? It wasn't the way that Caro describes it. The air was not dominated by the noise or the pollution of the trucks and the cars that were going along the expressway. What really dominated and spoiled my lunch at times was when a plane was going into LaGuardia. And that made 5 times as much noise as the traffic ever made, you know, much more unpleasant. And the East Tremont neighborhood, I know it rather well. I've written 4 articles about East Tremont on different things. That was what originally connected me to these pieces. I started off with just a random stick a pin in a map, have a neighborhood to study neighborhood dynamics. And then I got pulled into the Happy Land Social Club, Arson and Murder, and was working on that. And then I used to, you know, having spent my time talking to the families of the victims of the murder, would go and have my lunch sitting on top of the expressway. Oh, you know, Robert Caro's got this chapter, 1 mile about blah, 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 etc. You know. And then I sort of wrote a response to the 1 mile chapter back in the 1990s.
Definitely read your book.
And then have returned to, you know, this material since 2000.
I'm gonna sort of disagree maybe with your premise that Moses is being exaggerated by Caro or his relative importance, because it's like, to me, you know, dealing in public works and like everybody, it's like saying Babe Ruth only got on base 40% of the time. It's just another player. What Moses did was pretty extraordinary, and in the sense, as you point out, he's being vilified for the pain. But the painful parts were the hard parts. And when you say the New Jersey Turnpike or the Thruway were built very quickly, that's because when they were building the interstate systems, the rural ones were the easy ones. Because, as someone pointed out, they saved pointed out there's no land, no density. They could be built very quickly, and there were no environmental rules in the beginning of the system in place. By the time they reached the cross bonds, all the hard links were safe for pass, which were the urban, the safe for last, which were the urban expressways. Then they had environmental rules in there, all sorts of things that made it extraordinarily difficult. And yes, he only got some of the expressways in New York City, but someone else probably would have got none. And also, if any one of his hats, we're just talking highways here. If you talk about parks, the whole New York State park system, Thatcher Park, all the parks and everything like, that's one guy to do it. The Power Authority up in through the St. Lawrence River, the Niagara Power Project, all these things were built by one guy. This is a pretty extraordinary thing that any one area that he worked in, he would have been a monumental guy. And I think he handled the hard things. And like I say, by the way, recognizing engineers or the people who actually built, they used to do it before politicians usurped this. Because if you remember, when you pointed out, who remembers the people who built the cross Hudson, the bridges across the Hudson in New York City? Well, it's called Holland Tunnel for a reason. He was the engineer. It's called the Outer Bridge Crossing, not because it's the Outer Bridge, but the name of the engineer, his name was Outer Bridge. There was the Goethals Bridge.
Yeah.
So people did recognize the, what it was, but starting in the 50s and 60s, the politicians usurped it. So we no longer have the Tappan Bridge, we now have the Cuomo Bridge. Pretty much anything built after the 60s, named after Powell. But the thing is changing. And anyway, Moses does deserve a lot of the recognition. Now, maybe Caro is exaggerating, or his prose elevated, but this guy is a pretty extraordinary guy, not just another public works administrator.
Yeah, I've got no problems with, he was a pretty extraordinary guy, but it is difficult to imagine that there weren't pretty extraordinary guys in Chicago or in any other city where, major constructions were done. And when just for I-95 through Fairfield County in Connecticut, 15,000 people had their houses demolished and removed. We don't remember anybody as being responsible for that. When you take the Empire State Plaza, it's a larger number. And again, we don't think of anybody except Governor Rockefeller. The engineer is not there. And even the New Jersey Turnpike, 500 households had their houses destroyed just in
Probably Newark.
Sorry, it's just gone out of my head. Immediately south of Newark. The next town you have to Elizabeth, is it?
Oh,
Yeah.
Elizabeth.
Yeah, 500 houses in Elizabeth were demolished, and then more were demolished as the thing's been widened subsequently, and new intersections have been put in, and everyone has created demolitions. So that it's not so unusual, whether it was a Moses project or someone else's project. The strange thing is that there are no comparable cases where the supervisor of the project is memorialized. You know, Moses is put in a very extraordinary, extreme position in many senses.
Yeah, but I think it's not the one project. I mean, you could argue it, but like I said, the guy wore about 10 hats during his career. And in each of the fields, he's made an enduring mark. Most people don't even make an enduring mark in one field. This guy, and
Yeah. But an enduring mark in one state and in certain parts of one
well,
state.
because he only operated in one state. He didn't have the opportunity to operate nationally because of Roosevelt, but he probably would have done something there too, if Roosevelt didn't shun him.
But, you know, there is nowhere else in the US. There is no other sort of comparable figure who is, you know, even a tenth the scale of name recognition of Moses. That's the
Well,
awkward point, you know, in
Well, it's
terms of
because of the
how can we
book.
put this in proportion?
It's because of the book he gets the recognition. It's an extraordinarily successful book, pretty insightful, I thought. I'll give you another example of Moses. In the book, it points out when he worked for Al Smith, he reformed state government. And I worked for the state government 50 years after that reform. And I worked at it, well, you know, 80, you know, all these years. And the funny thing is the institutions he put in there are still at work, even though they're antiquated. I think I mentioned this to you. The budgeting system was a mess before Smith. He reformed the budgeting system, brought it up to date to the 1920s. I'm here working there through the 60s, 80s, 90s. The same budget system, it's antiquated. No one has the political power to change the system. He's just almost, whether he was manipulative or not, he basically was able to force things that other people couldn't do.
Well, he had the quirky characteristic compared with most people that he made sure that his name was attached to each project, each reform, each change, and so on.
Well,
even when it made him notorious, he was happier to be named than to not be named. And what, you know, I would say is, let's think about the hundreds, in fact, thousands of forgotten figures who did important things, took important decisions, but they were not named. You know, that's the awkward point. Because the other problem that you have in New York is people tend to say, oh, you can't do it because Robert Moses is dead. Only he could do it. You know, and then we've shifted from public works that are very visible, like highways and playgrounds, to public works like sewers and drains and water piping and flood protection and so on, which are not really visible, but they cost many billions of dollars. And the implication is now we're doing nothing because there's no Moses. There's no person, there's no, you know, etc. It distorts, in a sense, our perception of what gets done and what needs to be done. That's the.
I don't know.
Comment, not knowing very much about any of these matters, that any public administrator who didn't enrich himself as a result of having done all of this work, who actually claims to, and apparently with some degree of accuracy, claims to have been efficient and to have saved taxpayers' money while he was doing it. This is what I think I heard you accuse him of, and who started off planning neighborhood playgrounds for people, and who at least did some projects that haven't been subjected to as much criticism as I think I understand he can be subjected to. I mean, if all we're really accusing him of here is wanting to be famous, that sounds like small potatoes.
Yeah, it's an unusual package, especially, in the 21st century.
Exactly.
We expect people to be asking for staggering amounts of money just because they're famous. It's,
He saw
fame and
none of that.
fame and
He wanted
fortune
to
are
be-
intimately tied together. Moses separated them completely. It's,
Sounds good to me.
There was a game that I loved when I was a child called Careers.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, and in Careers, you had to set a goal. You needed 100 total units of fame, fortune, or happiness. Okay, units had to add up to 100. First person to reach his goal won. Well, you can see what Moses did. Not much about fortune. But he got the other two. Made a lot of
Yeah.
people happy. There were people who, society as a whole, there were absolutely things that harm people very much in the course of building it, in the course of the facilities, in the course of the displacement and so forth. But at the end, that's not remembered too long. Although now there's a movement, there's a counter movement. Tear down these highways. Or many of them.
yeah. But, it's what is happening, what's being torn down so far are the less functional portions of the system that,
Well, we'll see.
the major axes
I
are.
mean, there's a whole federal program as part of the Highway Act, part of the Surface Act, to actually allocate monies for this purpose, to take highways down, repurpose them. Already, there are several examples in New York State.
Yeah.
By the way, as an aside in New York State, notice that the thruway did not go through a single city. It went on the outskirts. At the time it was built, that was the easy place to put it. And then it was discovered, well, people wanted to go to Buffalo, not past Buffalo, or whatever. So a whole expressway system was put in place to take you from the thruway to
Into,
the inner city. So a lot of complaints about that now. And yet it was perceived as a very, very big problem at the time the thruway was built, because surface streets needed to be used to get into the central city. So, a lot of thinking on
Has anybody driven into Utica lately?
it. Well, I'm assuming anything left.
One more.
Apropos of your comment about No Place Else, do they identify specific people who are associated with the construction of these projects? The summer of 1970, I worked for the fellow who eventually became my father-in-law in Detroit. He lived in the west side of Detroit, and we would follow Grand River Avenue down almost to downtown. We crossed town a little bit to where his building was. And at that time, they were building I-96, now called the Jeffries Freeway. I don't know why. In any case, that was certainly not the size of the Katy in Houston, but in long stretches of it, it's at least 12 lanes wide. And it's built maybe 100 yards south of Grand River Avenue. Grand River Avenue is the major street, actually goes all the way across Michigan. And it was the most important thoroughfare in Detroit at the time. And I would recall talking with Bill every time we would drive down Grand River to get to his office while they were working on his freeways. Who is responsible for this? Because my sense was that they were cutting off half of the consumer base for all of the businesses along Grand River Avenue, because there would only be crossroads every half mile or mile there, and then you had to, just to get across that, you had to, if you didn't live right on that crossroad, you'd have forever to get across that, and you would lose all of that clientele, and I thought it was going to destroy Grand River Avenue. So I asked him several times, and he was pretty well connected in the city, but not necessarily the state though. Who's responsible for this? Why is it being built where it's being built? And I never got any sort of an answer for that. And the upshot of it is, of course, that's exactly what's happened. Grand River Avenue has died through much of Detroit because that throughway, the freeway, completely cut off half of the clientele for the businesses along Grand River Avenue. But there's nobody to blame because there's no particular person. You can't say, well, Moses is responsible for that. So everybody just bitches about it, but nothing would ever get done.
Ray, thank you so much. Let's have another. You too.
Pick up the program.
Why do I know your name?
Our next speaker is Millicent Eidson, who wrote Anthracis. It's the first of what she hopes will be 26 volumes of mysteries, all based on bioethics and all kinds of nifty stuff. She's now on C. She's got A, B, and C.
No, she's done D.
She's done D?
Done D.
Was in Scotland.
I don't know.
Done D? No, before Joe. And just as an aside, as we look into October, Sheila Curran Bernard will be at the Writers Book Fest. Just wrote a wonderful book on revising the Lead Belly legend. And she'll be speaking to us.